Inside a tavern, an auctioneer stands before a room filled with merchants and speculators. The lot consists of a tulip bulb, valued at over 1,500 florins, more than an average worker's entire year's salary. He announces the starting price, but there are no bids. Everyone looks at each other and realizes in that instant that the game is over. In a few days, that flower, which just days before was worth more than a house, now would be worth almost nothing. The bubble burst simply because the last buyer disappeared. For years, an entire nation believed that a flower was worth a fortune. That was Tulipmania, considered by many to be the first financial bubble in history. And to understand it, how this story began, and how everything fell apart, we need to go back in time. The year is 1593. A ship docked at Leidein in the Dutch Republic, carrying something Europe had never seen before. On board, a botanist named Carolus Clusius from the Ottoman Empire. In his luggage, tulip bulbs, an unknown flower, strangely shaped, with bulbs that looked more like onions and which would produce flowers with intense colors. Nothing like it had ever grown in European soil. Clusius had been hired by the University of Leiden to lead the Hortus Botanicus, one of the most respected scientific gardens on the continent. It was there that he planted the first tulip bulbs, and it was there that Europe saw for the very first time a tulip in bloom. But to understand why this flower became an obsession, we first need to understand the world in which it originated. The Dutch Republic, in that century, was the richest nation on earth. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, controlled the global spice trade. Amsterdam had the world's first stock exchange, and the first bank credit system accepted as currency across all of Europe. Money flowed in, and never stopped moving. But all this circulating wealth created a very personal problem. The Dutch society was Calvinist, a Protestant faith that considered the display of wealth a serious sin. Showing that you were rich through expensive clothes, jewelry, or an ornate home was pride, vanity, a turning away from God. The neighbors watched those who overspent, and the church judged rigorously. The result, wealthy merchants with Persian carpets and Chinese porcelain inside their homes had simple, undecorated facades. Rich men who could not look rich. The tulip solved that problem with almost perfect elegance. A flower is the work of God. Collecting it was admiration for divine creation, not vanity. Luxury with a clean conscience. But this ended up attracting less than noble glances too. In 1596, the Hortus Botanicus was broken during the night. The bulbs were stolen and sold in the region's black markets. Clusius lost years of work in a single night. But this theft was the moment when the tulip ceased to be a scientific rarity and became a commodity. The fire of the first financial bubble in modern history had found its spark. The tulip was not an ordinary flower, and cultivating it was not easy. It grew from a bulb buried in the autumn, dormant underground throughout the winter, and only bloomed in the spring. And when it died, it left behind just 1 or 2 offspring bulbs, which would take years to bloom again. To produce a single adult tulip, a grower waited an average of 3 to 7 years. No shortcuts, no way to speed it up. And the exclusivity didn't stop there. Some tulips, without explanation, simply transformed their own appearance. A solid red flower would suddenly display crimson flames over milky white golden streaks across dark petals, patterns that looked painted by an invisible brush. The Dutch called it brekken. What nobody knew at the time was that this phenomenon was caused by a virus, an invisible agent that traveled from plant to plant through common insects, suppressing a pigment and allowing other colors to show through on the surface. The effect was blazing, dramatic, almost supernatural. But all that exotic beauty hid a serious problem. The same virus that made the flower extraordinarily beautiful destroyed its ability to reproduce. The more exotic the appearance, the less the flower could multiply. This generated explosive demand and an impossible supply to meet. And of all the tulip varieties, there was one that stood out entirely alone. It was called Semper Augustus, white as ivory, pierced by crimson flames like frozen fire. In 1624, there were only 12 Semper Augustus bulbs in the entire world. They all belonged to a single man, Adrian Pau, director of the VOC. He kept them in a mirrored pavilion and refused to sell them at any price. Right below, the Viceroy, purple and white, equally dazzling. A single bulb was traded for grain, livestock, furniture, and clothing. A complete household inventory valued at 2,500 florins, more than 8 years' wages as a craftsman. In January 1637, someone offered 10,000 florins for a single Semper Augustus bulb, about $2 million today. For a single flower, the scarcity was real, the beauty was real, but the price now defied rational logic, increasing only in the expectation that someone would pay even more. The tulip market had no off-season. Demand was constant year-round. But the tulip did not respect the calendar of greed. The bulb slept beneath the earth all winter and only bloomed in spring, months when no physical transaction was possible. And there was a great deal of money with nowhere to go. The tulip had already solved the problem of display. Now it solved another: idle money. In a country where wealth could not be shown openly, the rare bulb had become a socially acceptable store of value, a way to hold wealth and signal it without sin. But if the flower only existed in spring and the money wanted to move now, why not trade before it existed? Speculators began signing forward contracts before notaries. The document promised to buy or sell a specific bulb when it bloomed the following spring. The bulb was still underground, but the paper was signed, the deal was done. The Dutch gave this practice a name: windhandel. The wind trade, what changed hands was not a flower. It was a promise about a flower that did not yet exist. The price no longer had anything to do with the actual tulip. It reflected only a belief how much that unborn flower would be worth in the hands of the next buyer. This market was not official. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange dismissed the fever with contempt. The windhandel moved into the taverns of Haarlem and Leidein. By candlelight and pipe smoke, men signed papers worth fortunes with not a single bulb in sight. There they formed the colleges, informal groups, unregulated, unsupervised. To join, you paid only the wijnkoopsgeld, the wine money, a small fee for the evening's drinks. A single buried bulb could change hands 10 times in one day through simple endorsements on contracts, 10 chained promises over the same flower that may not even have sprouted yet. What was being traded was no longer the tulip. It was the promise of the promise of the tulip. The system worked as long as everyone believed it worked. That is the only condition required for a bubble to exist. The night of February 3rd, 1630-7 should have been like any other. At the Mennisty Bruiloft Tavern in Haarlem, auctioneer Andries de Buscher took his usual place. The lot had been announced: Switzer bulbs, the variety that had multiplied in price by 12 in 5 weeks. He waited for the regular buyers to take their seats. Some chairs remained empty. Buscher announced the opening price. No one responded. He reduced it. Silence. He reduced it again. Nothing. No voice. No raised hand. That silence was not an accident. In the weeks before, the largest speculators had begun to move, quietly, without explanation, liquidating positions, walking away, and when the big players leave in silence, the small ones don't notice until it's too late. When the buyers who remained looked around and saw the empty chairs, something shifted. Not a rational thought, but a physical sensation, a hesitation. And hesitation in that market was contagion. If the big players aren't buying, why should I? If I don't buy, the next man won't either. If the next man doesn't buy, the paper in my hand is worthless. The same mechanism that had pushed prices upward, everyone buying because everyone was buying, now pushed in the opposite direction. Everyone selling because everyone was selling. That is the cascade effect, and it has no brakes. When there are more sellers than buyers, the price doesn't fall gradually. It collapses. Bulbs worth 1,500 florins, roughly $90,000 today, were offered for 50. There were no buyers, even then. The bubble did not burst with an explosion. It burst with a silence. What collapsed in February of 1637 was not the Dutch economy. What collapsed was the trust between men who had done business together for generations. That moral fracture, silent, invisible in the record books, was the true wound of the Tulipmania, not the bankruptcy, the betrayal. The betrayal remained, and, surprisingly, so did the market. The horticultural industry born from those stolen bulbs of 1596 still exists today and accounts for 2/3 of all global flower trade. After that February, they say an old man walked the streets of Haarlem, leaning on a cane. Whenever he found a tulip in a public garden, he cut it down with a sharp, furious blow, as if the flower itself were to blame. He didn't need to do that. The legendary Semper Augustus was already dying, not by anyone's hand, but by its own biology. The same agent that made it extraordinarily beautiful had always been consuming it from within. Silently, inevitably, it was never built to last. The beauty was the symptom, the destruction, the destiny. Every bubble shares that same structure, a real asset, a world that creates exactly the right conditions for excess, a door that opens for those who never should have entered, and the quiet discovery that the next buyer simply no longer exists. The tulip was the first documented bubble in modern history. Everyone that followed used the same script, different assets, different currencies, different centuries, but the structure never changes. If you enjoyed this video and this conversation taught you something, subscribe to the channel and like the video. This was another episode of How Money Flows, where the trail ends, the truth begins. See you in the next video. Bye.